He delivered the sentence with the sleek, practiced condescension of a man who had never suffered the real-world consequences of his own miscalculations. I do not pay you to think, Julian. That was the precise second my cognitive investment in Crown Point Asset Management came to an absolute, unrecoverable halt. It was not the moment he strutted into the 32nd floor corner office wearing custom-tailored cashmere with no necktie, radiating a suffocating cloud of expensive cologne and inherited self-importance. It was not when he mispronounced nonlinear mathematical optimization 3 distinct times during his introductory briefing to the senior quantitative engineering staff. It was right then, the exact moment after I had calmly, methodically demonstrated on the glass whiteboard how our automated portfolio architecture was projecting a severe volatility curve spike due to synthetic leverage signals in European derivative markets. He interrupted me with a dismissive wave of his manicured hand, as though I were a junior clerk complaining about minor paper jams in the printer room. I had spent 14 years of my life inside that institution. 14 long, grueling years. I had personally designed, built, and optimized Aegis, the autonomous market prediction engine that upper management now treated like a supernatural money-mining machine. To the executive committee, Aegis was a divine black box that whispered profitable trading signals from the heavens. But it was not magic. It was 14 years of rigorous applied mathematics, chronic insomnia, tens of thousands of hours of back-testing historical data, and roughly 270,000 lines of handcrafted quantitative C++ code. Exactly one human being alive understood the intricate internal feedback loops and tail risk dampeners that kept the system stable during extreme market stress, and that human being was 54 years old and sitting directly across from a 29-year-old trust fund beneficiary who believed executive leadership meant shouting over senior engineers. The mahogany glass-walled conference room fell utterly motionless. I could feel the collective gaze of 6 senior quantitative analysts and 2 executive vice presidents shifting away from the projection screens and anchoring directly onto me. They were waiting to see how the veteran quantitative architect would react. Would he argue? Would he slam his laptop shut and raise his voice in protest? Would he appeal to the board of directors? Instead, I simply unclipped my fountain pen, closed the cover of my leather notebook with a quiet, deliberate click, and adjusted my spectacles. His name was Tristan Dewitt. He was the only son of Gideon Dewitt, the legendary Wall Street financier who had built Crown Point from a boutique trading shop into a multi-billion-dollar fund during the deregulated financial expansion of the late 1980s. Gideon had recently retreated to a non-executive advisory role following a mild cardiac event, clearing the path for what the corporate press releases delicately described as a strategic legacy leadership transition. In plain terms, the founder had handed the steering wheel of a high-performance financial vessel to his untested heir and instructed the crew to applaud the performance. Tristan had spent his first 3 weeks on the job, striding through the trading floors in Italian suede loafers, dropping hollow buzzwords like hypervelocity synergy, investor captivation, and disruptive alpha allocation like stale breadcrumbs, attempting to establish dominance over professionals who had spent decades mastering stochastic calculus, partial differential equations, and financial risk modeling. When I had raised my hand during the weekly risk oversight session to explain that current macroeconomic conditions required immediate dampening of our algorithmic exposure limits, Tristan had scoffed openly. He leaned back in his executive leather chair, laced his fingers behind his head, and delivered his declaration with a smirk that belonged in a high school cafeteria rather than a licensed investment firm. "You are overcomplicating simple execution, Julian," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing amusement. "The algorithm works because the market moves, not because you constantly meddle with the internal parameters. We are expanding leverage targets by 30% starting tomorrow morning, so stop trying to micromanage the architecture." I do not pay you to think. I looked at him for 5 unbroken seconds. Behind his porcelain veneers and meticulously gelled hair, there was nothing but vast, unbothered ignorance. The serene, terrifying confidence of a man who had never seen an account liquidated, a client portfolio wiped out, or an emergency margin call executed by a clearing firm. I did not raise my voice. Under established principles of employment contract law and constructive discharge jurisprudence, an employee is not obligated to endure hostile, irrational directives that compromise professional ethics, fiduciary duty, and systemic regulatory compliance. I simply nodded, not in submission but in finality. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, my formal letter of resignation was printed, signed, and placed inside a crisp white envelope alongside my building access security credential. The atmosphere inside Crown Point Asset Management during those final weeks had become increasingly suffocating. For 14 years, I had watched the firm grow from a modest quantitative operation into an industry titan. My journey had begun in the early days of algorithmic trading, when mathematical models were still viewed with skepticism by traditional floor brokers. Over those 14 years, I devoted every working hour to perfecting the statistical foundations of Aegis. I built its multi-factor risk matrices, designed its real-time liquidity aggregators, and calibrated its adaptive execution handlers across multiple market cycles. I had sacrificed personal vacations, spent countless nights sleeping on a folding couch in my office during market panics, and protected the firm capital through unprecedented financial crises. Founder Gideon DeWitt had always recognized that mathematical rigor was the true foundation of our competitive advantage. Gideon was a seasoned market practitioner who understood that markets were volatile and unpredictable creatures, requiring constant vigilance and human oversight. However, when Gideon health deteriorated, the institutional culture transformed overnight. Tristan's arrival marked the beginning of an era characterized by shallow posturing and operational recklessness. Tristan possessed no background in quantitative finance, computer science, or statistical mechanics. His resume consisted of an undergraduate degree in communications, a fast-track master of business administration from an elite institution, and a series of short-lived vanity projects funded by his father's wealth. He viewed quantitative modeling not as a discipline requiring continuous intellectual labor, but as a commercial commodity that could be compressed, accelerated, and monetized without regard for risk governance. To Tristan, the complex differential equations powering Aegis were nothing more than decorative elements for investor pitch decks. He possessed the dangerous illusion that executive entitlement could substitute for technical competence. There was no dramatic confrontation, no parting lecture, and no emotional exit speech. I did not even use the firm official letterhead. 2 simple sentences printed on plain white copypaper sufficed. Effective immediately, I resigned from my position as Chief Quantitative Architect at Crown Point Asset Management. My building access credential and corporate laptop are enclosed herewith. I did not include polite pleasantries. I did not wish them continued success in their future endeavors. I was not interested in polishing a tombstone for a company walking willingly into a bonfire. The Human Resources Department was so thoroughly decoupled from operational reality that the junior coordinator accepted the envelope with an indifferent nod, swiped my badge through a deactivation scanner, and handed me a standardized departure packet without asking a single question regarding handover protocols or critical software dependencies. As I walked out through the polished granite lobby of the tower into the cool autumn afternoon, the air felt lighter. 14 years of high-frequency stress, 7 system-wide structural overhauls, and 5 major market panics navigated without a single unhedged loss were summarized into a single status change in an employee database and a statement for unused vacation time. Upstairs, according to a brief text message from a junior developer, Tristan was already holding court in the executive lounge, chuckling to his lieutenants that the old guard clearly could not handle the tempo of modern digital leadership. Tristan genuinely believed that Aegis was an immutable, self-sustaining financial engine. He assumed that because the software executed inside automated cloud clusters, it required no more human thought than an ordinary light switch. What Tristan did not comprehend, and what his expensive business school education had failed to teach him, was that Aegis was not a static machine. It was a complex, nonlinear dynamic system operating in continuous conversation with irrational market participants. Over 14 years, I had embedded hundreds of subtle calibration safety thresholds and adaptive feedback dampeners into the code execution layer. These were not documented in the high-level investor prospectuses because they were not commercial marketing points. They were the invisible shock absorbers that prevented the mathematical models from feeding on their own tail risk anomalies. When sudden market noise created recursive signal loops, my auxiliary calibration scripts would automatically smooth out the statistical variance before it could trigger compound derivative orders. It was the digital equivalent of a seasoned sea captain subtly adjusting the rudder every few minutes to keep a massive ocean liner from drifting off course in turbulent waters. Upon returning to my private apartment, I opened my personal encrypted dev server. I did not touch Crown Point property. I did not delete firm code, disrupt active databases, or inject malicious instructions. That would have violated federal computer fraud statutes and breached my ethical obligations as a licensed professional. Instead, I simply deleted my personal cloud synchronization task. A private, non-derivative set of auxiliary calibration scripts that ran locally on my home server to calculate real-time parameter adjustments that I had manually verified and applied each morning. These calibration inputs were my personal intellectual trade secrets, developed entirely outside my official scope of duties and fully protected under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, governing original software authorship. Crown Point owned the core open repository, but they did not own the daily cognitive labor required to tune it. Without those custom calibration inputs, Aegis was still completely operational from a technical standpoint. It would continue to execute trades, place orders, and compute probability matrices. But it would be doing so without its brakes, running entirely on unadjusted raw feedback loops in an increasingly volatile market environment. I closed my laptop, leaned back in my armchair, and poured 2 fingers of aged single malt scotch. The quiet in my apartment was absolute. I felt no rage, no bitter resentment, and no urge to seek theatrical vengeance. In the quantitative world, emotions are irrelevant noise. The universe operates strictly on cause, effect, and mathematical certainty. Tristan DeWitt believed that executive position conferred knowledge, and that corporate authority could override structural reality. He had explicitly demanded an environment where human thought was eliminated in favor of blind, aggressive execution. I was simply honoring his operational mandate. Gravity does not require permission to enforce its laws, and market dynamics do not negotiate with executive egos. I knew that within days the structural decay would begin, and when the eventual reckoning arrived, no amount of family influence or corporate public relations would be able to pause the arithmetic. As I settled into my home office following my departure, I reflected deeply on the structural boundary between employment obligations and individual intellectual property. In the financial software industry, companies often attempt to claim absolute ownership over every cognitive pattern developed by their employees. However, statutory law establishes clear limits on such corporate overreach. Under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, copyright protection extends specifically to original works of authorship fixed in a tangible medium. The custom calibration algorithms I had constructed over 14 years were designed as personal operational tools, auxiliary analytical models, created on my personal equipment outside working hours, to assist me in validating system behavior. They were never integrated into Crown Point permanent codebase, nor were they documented as company assets. They were the intellectual scaffolding that enabled me to perform my duties with mathematical precision. When I removed my personal server synchronization link, I was not sabotaging Crown Point systems. I was simply withholding my uncompensated personal intellectual labor. Crown Point retained complete possession of every line of code contained within the Aegis repository, every database record, and every server deployment script. If Tristan possessed the technical expertise he so loudly claimed, he and his engineering team were entirely free to develop their own calibration parameters. But I knew with absolute certainty that Tristan lacked both the mathematical capacity and the operational patience required to understand the system nonlinear feedback loops. He was operating a complex commercial aircraft with zero understanding of aerodynamics, convinced that holding the controls made him a master pilot. Over the next 5 days, Tristan wasted no time asserting his unbridled vision over Crown Point asset management. He organized a series of lavish investor presentations, broadcasting shiny new marketing decks to institutional clients and private wealth managers across Manhattan. In these webinars, he rebranded Aegis as an unconstrained, fully autonomous intelligence matrix capable of extracting hyper-alpha by eliminating what he termed legacy human friction. To demonstrate his resolve to the board of directors, Tristan instructed the systems engineering team to strip away the underlying latency buffers and override the wrist throttling mechanisms I had built into the order execution pipeline. He publicly declared that waiting 4 seconds to validate order flow signals was an obsolete relic of timid conservative management. He wanted trades executed in milliseconds, with maximum financial leverage applied to every short-term momentum signal. When senior compliance officers voiced deep hesitation, noting that removing risk throttles might breach internal governance mandates and duty of care standards under corporate law jurisprudence, Tristan dismissed their concerns with casual contempt, threatening to replace anyone who stood between the firm and aggressive capital expansion. From my new home office, I tracked global market feeds while evaluating several executive offers from competing financial institutions. By Wednesday afternoon, subtle anomalies began surfacing in Crown Point trading logs. Because Tristan had expanded leverage targets while disabling adaptive feedback dampeners, Aegis began misinterpreting short-term volatility spikes as long-term structural trends. In one glaring instance, the algorithm placed an overly aggressive long position on a mid-cap energy sector index, right as crude oil inventories experienced an unexpected build. Under normal operations, my daily calibration inputs would have flagged the inventory divergence and dampened the order size. Instead, without human intervention, Aegis interpreted the falling price as a temporary market discount and automatically doubled its position, accumulating millions of dollars in unhedged downside exposure within 20 minutes. On Thursday morning, I received a discreet phone call from Elias Thorne, a talented 31-year-old junior quantitative analyst whom I had mentored during his early years at Crown Point. Elias was anxious, his voice tight with restrained panic. "Julian," he whispered, taking the call from a stereo inside the building. "Something is wrong with the volatility decay calculations in the Aegis core engine. It just executed a series of high-volume short sales against a major technology conglomerate right before their quarterly earnings release. And the variance numbers look completely inverted. Did you leave any documentation on how the risk dampeners interact with synthetic derivative spikes?" I took a slow, deliberate breath before answering. Elias was a capable engineer, but he had only worked under my direct supervision and had never been given access to the raw calibration frameworks that I maintained independently. I spoke calmly to the young analyst. "Elias," I replied softly, "any technical documentation I produced during my employment is stored in the Central Engineering Repository under standard compliance protocols. However, as of Monday afternoon, Tristan made it explicitly clear to the entire department that human analytical intervention is considered unnecessary friction. He formally instructed the team that he does not pay staff to think. If you attempt to manually override the system now, he will hold you personally responsible for any reduced trading velocity. Protect yourself, keep your own records, and do not fall on a sword for a management team that views engineering as a disposable utility." There was a long pause on the line. Elias let out a heavy, defeated sigh. He understood the legal and professional implications immediately. Under federal employment frameworks, including the parameters of the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, under Title 29 of the United States Codes, Section 2101, employees forced into high-risk compliance environments must exercise extreme caution to avoid personal liability for executive recklessness. Elias thanked me quietly and ended the call. By Friday afternoon, the internal tension inside Crown Point had reached a boiling point, even as Tristan continued to host celebratory champagne toasts in the executive lounge. He announced to the trading floor that week-to-week transaction volume had increased by 40%, claiming that his aggressive streamlining had already proven the old guard wrong. He was entirely blind to the fact that his volume surge was not driven by profitable strategy execution, but by an uncalibrated mathematical model frantically chasing its own tail in a darkening market storm. Aegis was buying high, selling low, and doubling down on volatile derivative contracts to cover its own internal statistical discrepancies. The engine was spinning faster and faster, generating massive transaction counts while quietly eroding the core collateral foundation of the institution. The legal landscape surrounding corporate governance and executive accountability provides robust remedies for systemic recklessness. Under established corporate law jurisprudence, corporate officers and directors owe an unyielding fiduciary duty of loyalty, care, and good faith to their institutions and investors. When an executive deliberately dismantles established risk management safeguards, ignores compliance warnings, and exposes client assets to unquantified tail risks for personal vanity, that executive commits an actionable breach of fiduciary duty. Furthermore, actions taken in direct violation of internal compliance protocols and statutory risk mandates may be declared void ab initio under corporate governance standards, stripping the officer of indemnification protections. As the trading anomalies escalated throughout the week, it became evident that Tristan actions were creating massive legal exposure for Crown Point. The artificial volume inflation generated by Aegis' uncalibrated trading loops constituted a potential violation of federal securities regulations, prohibiting market manipulation and misleading financial disclosures. Under Section 1519 of Title 18 of the United States Code, enacted as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, knowingly altering, falsifying, or obscuring financial risk records in anticipation of regulatory oversight carries severe criminal penalties. Tristan was not merely mismanaging an investment portfolio. He was building a complex web of legal liabilities that would inevitably collapse upon the entire institution. The inevitable catastrophe arrived on Monday morning at 9:17 in the Eastern Time Zone. Global semiconductor markets experienced a sudden, unexpected shift following a surprise trade policy announcement out of Washington. Major technology stocks surged upward in a sharp, nonlinear spike. Aegis, which had been locked into a massive, uncalibrated short position across multiple leveraged exchange-traded funds, misread the upward surge as an anomalous data outlier. Because Tristan had completely removed the risk dampeners and forced the system to execute trades without latency. Confirmation: Aegis did not pause to reassess its mathematical assumptions. Instead, the automated model executed a massive, recursive double-down order, dumping hundreds of millions of dollars into inverse derivatives to force the statistical curve back into alignment with its erroneous predictions. Within 9 minutes of the market opening bell, the catastrophic feedback loop wiped out $13,800,000 in liquid trading capital. As the market continued to rally against the firm position, the automated system began firing execution commands like an uncontrolled machine in an enclosed space. It drew upon secondary liquidity reserves, liquidated high-grade corporate bonds at steep discounts to meet immediate collateral requirements, and entered into increasingly desperate synthetic futures contracts to maintain its margin obligations. By 10:45 that morning, the cumulative losses on the Aegis desk had shattered $29 million, and the execution engine was cascading into a full-scale algorithmic death spiral. Inside the Crown Point trading floor, total chaos erupted. Alarm sirens on risk monitoring terminals began blaring continuously as capital threshold alerts were breached across every major asset class. Red screens flashed throughout the 32nd floor. Institutional prime brokers began placing urgent, aggressive phone calls demanding immediate collateral top-ups. Traders were shouting over one another, junior analysts were frozen in panic, and one senior portfolio manager reportedly suffered a severe panic attack and had to be assisted from the floor. Tristan emerged from his private office, his face pale, his expensive suit jacket discarded, shouting incoherent orders at the engineering staff. "Shut it down," he screamed, his voice cracking with terrified hysteria. "Manual override! Kill the servers! Pull the power cables!" However, Tristan had never bothered to learn basic system architecture. When he had instructed the IT department to streamline the infrastructure 3 weeks prior, he had authorized the deployment of an immutable cloud execution framework that prevented manual mid-session overrides without a 3-tier cryptographic master key, a security feature designed to prevent unauthorized employee tampering. The only person who held the operational authority and master cryptographic configuration to safely disengage the automated trading pipeline without corrupting the underlying portfolio ledger was me. When the engineering leads informed Tristan that attempting an abrupt hard shutdown of the cloud servers would immediately freeze all open derivative contracts in a defaulted state, triggering mandatory liquidations by clearing houses under Federal Reserve oversight rules, Tristan collapsed into an office chair, speechless and shivering. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, news of the disaster leaked onto financial news wires. Financial media outlets broke the story with breaking headline banners. Crown Point Asset Management suffers catastrophic algorithmic collapse. Estimated exposure exceeds $100 million. The news sent shockwaves through the institutional investor community. Sovereign wealth funds, corporate pension funds, and high-net-worth private clients initiated a massive, unprecedented run on the firm, filing formal redemption notices and demanding the immediate return of their unencumbered assets. By the close of regular trading at 4 o'clock, Crown Point had suffered an unprecedented $115 million in direct trading losses, with secondary collateral impairments bringing total portfolio damage to nearly $195 million in a single trading session. The human toll on the trading floor during those catastrophic hours was devastating to witness. Analysts and developers who had dedicated years of their careers to Crown Point watched helplessly as their equity compensation and career stability vanished in real time. Elias Thorne later described the atmosphere inside the building as a scene of complete institutional panic. Executive vice presidents who had supported Tristan's reckless restructuring spent the morning frantically attempting to contact legal counsel and personal public relations advisors, seeking to distance themselves from the unfolding disaster. The very individuals who had sat silently during risk oversight meetings while Tristan insulted senior engineering staff were now desperately searching for scapegoats among the junior technical crew. The fundamental flaw in Tristan management philosophy was his total failure to understand that quantitative trading systems do not operate in a vacuum. Aegis was connected to multiple global execution venues, clearing networks, and prime brokerage liquidity pools. When the algorithm began cascading into recursive error loops, its automated orders triggered collateral warnings across the entire financial ecosystem. Prime brokers, bound by strict regulatory capital requirements under Federal Reserve oversight rules, were legally obligated to protect their own clearing institutions by issuing immediate margin calls and freezing Crown Point collateral accounts. Tristan's belief that he could negotiate or charm his way out of an algorithmic liquidation demonstrated his profound detachment from modern financial mechanics. That evening, I sat in the executive conference room of Apex Horizon Capital, a prestigious, highly respected asset management institution located 10 blocks north of Crown Point. 2 hours prior, I had formally executed an employment agreement to become their chief technology officer and managing director of quantitative strategy. My new position came with complete operational autonomy, a dedicated team of brilliant software engineers, and a substantial compensation package anchored by equity performance incentives. Unlike Crown Point, the executive leadership at Apex Horizon understood that cutting-edge quantitative finance is not a substitute for human intellect, but an amplification of it. While sipping green tea and reviewing our firm preliminary asset allocation strategy for the upcoming quarter, my phone chimed on the table. It was a call from an unlisted Manhattan landline. I answered calmly. "Julian?" came the voice on the line. It was Gideon DeWitt, the founder of Crown Point. He sounded old, exhausted, and broken, his legendary boom reduced to a raspy, desperate whisper. "Julian, please, I am calling you personally. The firm is bleeding to death. Tristan made catastrophic errors. He did not understand what he was touching. We are facing complete regulatory collapse and total liquidation by Friday if we cannot stabilize the Aegis core engine. I will pay you any consulting fee you request. Name your price. $5 million, $10 million, full equity control. Just come back and fix the architecture before the Securities and Exchange Commission freezes our operational licenses. I listened patiently to the desperate patriarch. Under the established principles of corporate jurisprudence, an executive officer who permits uncalibrated, high-risk operational practices that destroy shareholder equity commits a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty and corporate asset dissipation. The damage Tristan had inflicted was not a temporary software bug that could be patched over a weekend. It was a total collapse of institutional governance and structural risk integrity. The firm operational procedures were void ab initio, irrecoverable due to the sheer volume of unauthorized risk overrides executed under Tristan command. Gideon, I replied in a calm, steady, measured voice. I served Crown Point honorably for 14 years. I built Aegis from the ground up, brick by brick, equation by equation. But when your son took command of the firm, he explicitly informed me in front of the entire senior staff that my cognitive contributions were worthless. He stated unequivocally that he did not pay me to think. I accepted his executive directive. I walked away and I took my thinking with me. What you are experiencing today is not a technical malfunction. It is the exact mathematical cost of unmitigated hubris. I cannot fix a system that was intentionally stripped of its intelligence. There was a long, devastating silence on the line. I could hear the faint sound of Gideon heavy, ragged breathing, punctuated by the distant noise of ringing phones in the background of his doomed trading floor. I gently ended the call and placed the phone back on the desk. That night, federal regulatory authorities, including investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, issued formal administrative subpoenas to Crown Point Asset Management, launching a sweeping federal inquiry into potential violations of Section 1519 of Title 18 of the United States Code regarding corporate record falsification and risk disclosure fraud under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. On Friday morning, trading in all Crown Point investment funds was officially suspended by regulatory authorities. The once mighty firm was forced into emergency liquidation procedures. Broad financial publications published detailed front-page feature stories analyzing the downfall of Crown Point, identifying the reckless removal of algorithmic risk controls by Tristan DeWitt as the primary catalyst for the fastest institutional collapse in recent Wall Street history. Tristan was immediately stripped of all executive authority by the board of directors and faced multiple civil lawsuits from enraged institutional investors seeking personal liability judgments for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. 3 weeks later, Apex Horizon Capital participated in the court-supervised bankruptcy auction of Crown Point remaining distressed assets. Operating with complete strategic authority, I directed Apex Horizon to acquire Crown Point intellectual property portfolio, including the core Aegis repository, for a fraction of its former valuation, paying just 14 cents on the dollar for software that had once anchored a multi-billion-dollar fund. We integrated the codebase into our robust multi-layered risk management architecture, restoring the proprietary calibration safety dampeners that I had originally designed, standing in my new corner office on the 45th floor. Looking out over the panoramic skyline of Manhattan as rain fell gently against the glass, I reviewed the final integration report for the newly designated Apex Aegis engine. The software was running smoothly, generating steady, risk-adjusted returns within strict compliance boundaries. My terminal displayed a clean, green interface, free of anomalous variants or unhedged exposure loops. Elias Thorne, whom I had personally hired as a vice president of quantitative research at Apex Horizon, walked into my office and placed a signed compliance authorization sheet on my desk. Elias smiled warmly, looking around the bright, quiet office where engineers and quantitative analysts worked in collaborative, respectful silence. "It is good to be working in an environment where people actually respect mathematics, Julian," he said softly. I signed the compliance document, handed it back to him, and looked out across the city toward the darkened, empty floor of Crown Point former headquarters 10 blocks away. I smiled faintly and turned back to my monitor. Yes, Elias, I replied with quiet satisfaction. It turns out that thinking is the most valuable asset on Wall Street. The aftermath of the Crown Point collapse served as a stark case study in financial history. Within days of the firm liquidation, academic researchers and industry analysts began publishing detailed post-mortem evaluations of the catastrophe. The consensus across Wall Street was unanimous. The downfall of Crown Point was not caused by unpredictable market volatility or external economic shocks, but by an egregious failure of internal governance and executive hubris. The reckless decision to remove quantitative risk throttles and force out senior engineering expertise was cited in multiple industry journals as a classic example of organizational decay driven by unearned authority. At Apex Horizon Capital, our team demonstrated the true potential of properly calibrated quantitative modeling. Under my leadership as Chief Technology Officer, the newly integrated Apex Aegis engine delivered exceptional risk-adjusted performance while operating under strict risk governance protocols. We established an open, collaborative environment where mathematical rigor was celebrated, compliance mandates were respected, and human analytical insight was valued as the supreme driving force behind every trading algorithm. Standing at the forefront of quantitative innovation, surrounded by brilliant colleagues who valued truth over corporate posturing, I knew that justice had been executed with absolute mathematical precision.